One of the best things about the rise of Zack Polanski is that finally the British political establishment are discussing and debating something other than only immigration. Of course, they're still discussing and debating immigration, but not only immigration, and that's important. Now, most of the eco-populist focus has so far been on wealth taxes, which we'll be looking at in great detail in the run-up to the budget. This policy, though, is also interesting. And so this is from the Green Party Twitter account. The average FTSE 100 CEO is now paid 122 times the salary of the average full-time UK worker. The Green Party would introduce a 10-to-1 pay ratio, meaning the highest paid employee cannot earn more than 10 times the lowest paid employee. Now, that's a tweet from the summer. It's got renewed attention, though, this week because entrepreneur influencer David Priestley stumbled across it. He's been on Diary of a CEO a number of times, launched a couple of companies. And he said this: the latest big idea from Zack Polanski is to make sure CEOs can't earn more than 10 times what their workers are paid. The shelf stackers at Tesco are going to love earning £900,000 a year. Either that, or they have to find someone to run a £700 billion public company for £250,000 per year, about a third as much as a partner at EY, which is Ernst and Young, so an accounting firm. These people don't live in reality. He goes on to expand, and he says, strangely, the typical Brit understands why a footballer gets paid a lot, but it seems like most people have no idea how hard it would be to be a CEO. The CEO of Tesco makes £9 million a year. This is the top job for a business that is a supermarket, bank, telephone company, and insurance provider. This business has over 340,000 employees and generates £70 billion in revenue. It has over 50,000 suppliers. He goes on, this type of person has options. They could start their own business. They could work at any number of companies globally. They could do merger and acquisition deals or join a private equity firm. All of these roles would pay £5 to £10 million. A CEO is also independently wealthy by the time they get to this level. Why take on the stress of this job if the money isn't significant? And he says all of this is to say that anyone who thinks anyone could do the job or that a great CEO would do it for $500K a year is simply naive to what's involved. It's like me saying, doesn't a footballer just kick a ball around? I'd kick a ball around for half the price. If the Tesco board could get a CEO for millions cheaper, they would. Every little helps after all. That's an interesting argument, and we'll talk about it in more detail in a moment. First of all, I'll show you a similar one made by Christopher Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs. So he said, in response to the Green Party tweet, this could have two outcomes. Either FTSE 100 companies will start paying unskilled people £300,000 a year for menial work, or the best CEOs will refuse to work for British companies. Impossible to know how it will play out, with a laughing face, because he's saying, obviously, the best CEOs will just work abroad or move abroad. So, what do I think about this? Well, on an ethical level, I think it's simple. It's clear that there is no reason for anyone to be paid 10 times more than anyone else. I do think it's probably true that being CEO of a large company is a more stressful job, requiring a broader skill set than many lower-rung jobs at a corporation. So it's reasonable they get paid more. The idea is 10 times harder, 10 times more stressful, 10 times more skilled, and so forth. They should get paid more than that, I think is impossible to justify, right? If you think they'll say, oh, I think I might as well just stack shelves because I'm only getting paid 10 times more if I'm CEO than if I'm stacking shelves, that's ridiculous. Obviously, the idea they need to be paid 122 times the amount of cleaners or shelf stackers, well, that's just obscene. The pragmatic argument, though, has a bit more weight. Harder to dismiss. Companies clearly do think that an exceptional CEO makes a big difference to the success of that firm. That's why they're willing to pay a lot of money to secure them. They're not doing it out of the kindness of their heart because they really like that CEO. They think they want to secure that person. And to some extent, this is an international market. If talented people can get paid 10 times more in the United States than they can in the UK to run a big corporation, some might decide to do that. Not all. Lots of them will want to live in the UK, in London, because there's lots of advantages to that, but some might move to the United States. I do think, though, there's something incoherent about this logic. In a country where the Prime Minister gets paid £172,000, the Chief Executive of the NHS gets paid £300,000, right? So you say, obviously, if it's a stressful job, if you want to get the best people, you have to charge, or you have to pay them £9 million. Well, the NHS employs 1.5 million people. It's 5 times more than the amount employed by Tesco. I'd also hazard a guess that it's a more stressful job than working for Tesco, because you don't just have your shareholders down your neck. You also have the government, the public. You also have this sort of moral hazard that if you don't do your job to the best of your ability, well, even if you do your job to the best of your ability, there'll be lots of people who are waiting a lot longer for operations than they should. Incredibly stressful job. We really want the best people doing that job. Yet none of these right-wingers argue that the state needs more money so that it can offer wages to compete for the best talent. That's what we hear about in these industries. In fact, they argue the opposite. For example, every year the Taxpayers Alliance releases what it calls the NHS Rich List, supposedly shining a light on public service excess. And the highest salary they found this year was £400,000 for the chief executive of Plymouth Hospitals. That is more than double the amount paid to the Prime Minister, but it's also 22 times less than the boss of Tesco, a company which we're told would collapse if its boss were to receive a modest pay cut. Aaron, first of all, I am very glad that we now have a proactive Green Party, meaning that we're debating issues about economic inequality instead of just the debate all being about immigration, because you've got Reform who want to talk about immigration and Labour who will just talk about whatever Reform talk about. So I think this is great that this is creating a row, because we can talk about something, I think, more interesting, right, than small boats, which is the vast inequality we have when it comes to pay in this country. I'm sure there will be practical challenges to a 10-to-1 pay ratio. There's also a practical advantage, which lots of people don't talk about, which is that, if you want to get more people to work in the public sector for really important jobs, however right-wing you are, I think you accept that I'm not talking to you, however right-wing a viewer is, I think people accept that the CEO of the NHS is a very important job. Now, if you want to get the best talent, either you have to raise the salary of that job, or you have to reduce the salary of competing jobs. So if we made it so that the City of London wasn't paying such vast salaries to people to be bankers, then maybe it would be easier to get them to manage the NHS or to manage HS2, for example. So there'd be an advantage there. I want your thoughts on this, on the 10-to-1 pay ratio policy from the Greens.
Well, I think 10-to-1 is probably a bit too adventurous. Right now, I think the FTSE, in terms of CEO top pay, the pay ratio of the UK is actually really high by European standards. If you look at similar measures for countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they're much lower. And those countries are wealthier in terms of GDP per capita. They have higher productivity. Norway and Sweden, I think Denmark too, per capita have more billionaires than we do. I mean, I find that quite remarkable, frankly. Spotify is a more successful technology coming out of Sweden, of course, than any technology company the UK has produced. Novo Nordisk, the company behind Ozempic, is of course based in Denmark. So the idea that you have to have astronomical pay ratios between low earners and high earners in order to have high innovation, high productivity, successful economies, successful market economies, it's just not true. This is just a low IQ, identikit Thatcherite take, which, by the way, that guy is a specialist at. He's a specialist at. You could use generative AI for his takes. They're just, room temperature IQ, Thatcherite takes on everything. The more inequality we have, the more innovative an economy will be. Just stupid. To make the pie as large as possible, you have to have massive inequality. Just, again, stupid. Disproven empirically over many decades now. So I think that certainly we could be addressing top to bottom pay in the private sector and the public sector too. There are pretty stringent public sector pay ratios from top to bottom in China. They seem to get some things right when it comes to delivering public projects. Other countries as well. So I would favour that personally. I'm not opposed to it in the private sector. I do think there's a role for government in the medium and short term to get that down. It doesn't help anyone having runaway executive pay while having people at the bottom who actually can't consume things. This is a really important iron law of economics. People with the least money are the most disposed to spending discretionary income. Okay, people with the most money are the least disposed to spending in terms of adding aggregate demand to the economy. They're going to either save that, or more likely, they put it into assets which generate a return. And as Gary Stevenson has said, that only exacerbates rentierism within the economy and actually makes inequality even worse. So I fundamentally disagree with what this gentleman is saying and what Chris Snowdon is saying. I think 10-to-1 in the private sector is just not realistic in the short to medium term, which, by the way, we should be thinking in those terms now, right? The Green Party after the next general election could have 45 MPs. There's a Lib Lab coalition and they need the Greens for a majority. That could happen. Okay. So what would the policy be? I would like to see something pretty stringent in the public sector, and in the private sector, I don't know. really interesting, Michael, in the Royal Navy, the pay ratio from top to bottom within that organization is around 7.5 to 1. It's the same in the British Army. It's the same in the US Navy. It's the same in the American military. In organizations where you have to have such a strong and robust culture where people are willing to die for each other, you can't have this massive differential in terms of pay. So the idea that an effective organization has to have that is clearly not borne out in that kind of example. Here in Novara Media, Michael, we have a 1-to-1 pay ratio. So we can speak with some experience. Everybody in the organization earns the same. Is that ideal? I don't think it is. I think that somebody with 2 kids who's 50 probably needs more money than a freshly graduated 22-year-old kid. Okay. That's my personal view. But the pay ratio should be maybe 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, right? Maximum. It's certainly 1.5 to 1. That's a hell of a lot of difference. 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 to 1 is simply too much. It's not good for innovation. It's not good for productivity. It's not good for social cohesion. It's not good for final demand. There is no argument for this stuff. And I think we start in the public sector. You have people like the vice principal of University College London. Used to be a guy called Malcolm Grant, I think. He was on about £450,000 a year. I think that didn't even include his pension. Maybe it did. Circa, best part of £500,000 a year, right? The lowest earner, and this is about 15 years ago. Wild. The lowest earner at UCL was not on £40,000. I think a 10-to-1 pay ratio at somewhere like University College London, a public institution, is a very sensible thing to have. And I agree. I think that would be the start of this shift. I think we can change that ratio between top to bottom earners in the private sector through sectoral wage bargaining, stronger trade unions, and so on. And I think that's how you would do it rather than legislate for a top to bottom thing. Only one place has tried that, as I understand. Switzerland had a referendum on it in 2013. People voted against it. I think on a 12 or 13 to 1 pay ratio. I like the sentiment. I like the impulse. I think we get there via other means.
I think I agree with lots of what you're saying, but I think there's a fundamental thing that you're saying, which is disagreeing with what I was saying, which is probably useful to flesh out, because I was saying a big problem at the moment is that we are quite restrictive with public sector pay, but we're not at all restrictive with private sector pay. And what that means is that it is difficult, potentially, to attract the best people into the public sector. And I suppose what you're saying is we should be even more restrictive with the public sector and not more restrictive with the private sector, which would just give the private sector, I suppose, an even bigger advantage when it comes to attracting people to work in stressful jobs. So where are we on that?
Not necessarily. I think basically people at the bottom end of the ladder would be earning more, but also there are people in the public sector, Michael, who earn a king's ransom. Okay? Some of the wrong people. If you look at, for instance, deputy mayors around Sadiq Khan, they're earning tremendous amounts of money. They're almost earning as much as the Prime Minister. That's crazy. The Prime Minister, in my mind, should be earning more. I think MPs probably should be earning marginally more. I think that case is over-egged because they have great holidays. They have an amazing pension package. The IPSA pay package is incredible for pensions, which parliamentarians get, and their staffers get as well. So to some extent, I do agree. But what we were paying people in, for instance, some of the contracts around HS2 were just wild in terms of what people were being given. I think at one point the guy who was the top dog of HS2 was the most well-paid public servant in the country. Given that project was massively, massively, massively over budget, I would question whether that was a sensible thing to do. I do agree that certain people in certain places in the public sector should be earning more money. Malcolm Grant at UCL should not be earning £450,000 a year in 2010. The Prime Minister probably should be on £200,000 plus. And I say that, why? Why should the Prime Minister be on more money than they are? Because, you know what, if you're a socialist, you won't want to spend it all. Maybe you want to give it away. Maybe you give it back to HMRC. That's fine. We have a situation right now where we have prime ministers who don't earn much money like Boris Johnson, and the incentives are, well, I'll earn more money once I leave office. And that's bad. That creates really bad incentives if you want effective government when they're in number 10. So I agree with you on a lot of jobs. We don't pay for instance, people in the financial the financial FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority it used to be called, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority. We don't pay them enough. They leave. They then go and work for the big banks. How do we get around? How do we subvert the regulation? So again, they should probably be paid more. But there are lots of people in the public sector paid way too much.
I quite like the Singapore model where they just pay their politicians really well and then it's really fucking hard on corruption. Like that you're not allowed to take any donations at all, but you get a good salary, and that country seems to work all right.